The wind off the headland always smelled like old tin and salt, as if the cliff itself were rusting back into the sea. Talitha Norris stood with her palm on the flaking steel door of the decommissioned radar dome and tried to slow her breathing. The town below, Gullhaven, a ragged crescent of rooftops and boat masts, had already judged her. That girl who bought the government ruin. That girl who lives on coffee, solder fumes, and bad ideas. That girl who doesn't understand when to stop. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. Talitha pressed the latch and shoved. The door peeled open with a grunt and a gasp of stale air. Inside the dome was a cavern of silence and possibility, ribbed ribs of fiberglass stained by storms, a floor of torn rubber matting, and skeletal racks where black boxes had once blinked. While the town grumbled, she had memorized the old manuals until their pages were a second skin, antenna rotation calibrations, waveguide pressurization, primary power sequences. While they laughed, she had scrounged the orphaned parts, an L-band klystron here, a dusty pedestal servo there, a trove of coaxial relays from a scrapyard 2 counties inland. The dish crouched in the dome's center, a 20-meter pedal of faded composite, asleep on its gimbal, like a giant eye that had decided to stop watching. She touched its rim and felt the dust print to her skin. You used to guard these skies, she thought. Now it's just me. She had spent 2 months making it less broken, days cleaning mouse nests from conduits, nights tracing the logic of a control cabinet with a dental pick and a headlamp. A retired electrician named Ephraim Cole, whose hands could coax breath back into anything that rotated, had begun stopping by. He never announced himself, just appeared in the doorway with a thermos and a frown and a question she hadn't yet asked. "Your azimuth drive wants love, kid," he'd mutter, running a finger over the ring gear. "When's the last time this had lithium grease that didn't smell like shipwreck?" "Before I was born," she'd answer, which was true for most of it. The installation had been a Cold War sentinel. Then budgets changed, and the dome had turned into a gull roost with a chain-link crown and a do-not-enter sign that meant nothing to a woman too stubborn to read it. Morning by morning, the place remembered how to be a machine. She replaced desiccant towers and sealed hairline cracks and waveguides, listening for the hiss that would betray a leak. She coaxed the pedestal to jog a single degree and then another. She rebuilt the cooling loop so the klystron wouldn't scream itself to death from heat when it finally sang again. She cheated rust with phosphoric acid and time, and when the winch balked at bringing a new transformer through the hatch, she bribed it with patience and Ephraim's swear words. Gullhaven watched her from a distance. At the bait shop, men leaned on sacks of crushed ice and said she had scholar's hands and a gambler's heart. At the diner, the line cook asked how many antennas it took to buy a clue. Children biked out to the chain-link fence and tied ribbons in the fence, bright little prayers that fluttered in the wind. It never bothered her until it did, the week the harbor lost a boat, the week the sea took the Calico Jane in a fog so thick you could chew it. When the town gathered on the pier with lanterns and silence, Talitha stood beside them, tasting the same salt, wishing she already had the radar awake, not to find ghosts, to give the living another pair of eyes. "Kid," Ephraim said softly as they watched the Coast Guard cutter comb the gray water, "you don't have to carry the whole horizon by yourself."
"I know," she said, but secretly she didn't. Or if she did, she didn't know how to want anything less. The acquisition had been simple on paper. A surplus site no one wanted, sold for almost nothing to the only bidder patient enough to wait through the paperwork. In reality, it had taken a year of learning how to talk to agencies that preferred not to answer phones. She had done it between shifts at the ferry terminal, where she sold tickets and memorized the way storms built their faces from the west. She slept in a rented trailer in the lee of the dome and woke to foghorns that reminded her of low organs and a dark church. Her mother called every Sunday. You're eating? Enough, Talitha lied. You're safe? As anyone is, she said, and meant it. Safety, she had decided, wasn't a fence or a padlock. It was knowing how something worked and where it would break. On the 45th morning after she'd taken possession, a truck with paint the color of old bone wound up the headland road. A woman stepped out and tilted her chin at the dome like a judge assessing a suspect. She wore a county badge, mud on her boots, and hair braided so tight it looked like a statement. "You're Miss Noor," she said. "I am. Inspector Howell. I'm here to see that none of this kills anyone who didn't volunteer." Talitha handed her a hard hat and led her inside. Howell's pen moved, prodding at wiring bundles, peering into panels. "You're bringing a high-powered transmitter online," she said at last. "That means radiation safety, arc flash boundaries, an exclusion zone, and a list of people who know where you are and why they should not approach the dish with a ladder and a selfie stick. I have the signage, I have a fence, I have a lockout-tagout plan, and a Faraday cage around the control room." Howell studied her. "You have the look of someone who sleeps next to a notebook. Good. If you can keep the town's teenagers from deciding this is a dare, you can keep the county happy." "I'm not doing this for dares." "Why are you doing it?" There were answers that would satisfy a form: research, restoration, history. There was the answer that made her hands tremble. "Because this hill used to watch over people," she said, and the words surprised her with how true they felt on her tongue. "Because maybe it still can." Howell's gaze softened by a degree. "You have a radio operator's license?" "I passed last winter." "Good. You have someone to call when it goes sideways?" Talitha thought of Ephraim's thermos and his quiet faith. "Yes." "Then call me when you spin it," Howell said, and scraped her signature across the clearance sheet. They chose a date like people choose a launch day for a small boat. Not a day predicted by forecasts or signed off by weather gods, but a day that felt like it might want to be kind. The shop that she had carved from the old generator room looked almost clean. She had scrubbed the oil pan until it shone dimly, replaced belts until they lay straight, begged a new AVR from a distributor who'd taken pity on her emails. When she thumbed the starter, the diesel coughed, frowned, and then decided to be born. The sound filled the dome like a heartbeat. The overhead lights steadied. The rack fans woke one after the other, a chorus of small winds. "Moment of truth," Ephraim said softly, as if noise might spook it. Talitha leaned into the control console, the metal cool under her wrist. She had dreamed the sequence so many times she could recite it in sleep. She reached for the primary power breaker, but stopped. "Wait." Ephraim had learned not to argue with that word. "What do you feel?" "Not feel," she said. "Remember." She walked to the base of the dish and laid her ear against the pedestal housing, listening for the language of bearings. The old bronze sang to her like a kettle from another room. "Right. We grease. We don't ask a thing to move until we apologize to it for forgetting it was alive."
By the time they finished, the light had gone full ocean gray. The town below blinked on porch bulbs and kitchen windows. The gulls gave up on the day and tucked their heads under their wings. Talitha swallowed, returned to the console, and flipped the breaker. The dome felt it. The dish shivered, then eased, then steadied, as if waking from a winter too long. Numbers appeared on the CRT, green digits that felt like a door opening. The motor control panel delivered an even hum. Her palm hovered over the start rotation button. She pressed it. Some machines lurch, some argue. This one simply turned. Slow, deliberate,
The azimuth gear engaged, and the dish began to sweep its circle, an invisible finger tracing the horizon through composite and air. Talitha felt her breath hitch. It is moving, she thought. It is moving because I asked, and because it forgave me for asking. On the display, a skeletal compass ticked. The radome muffled the wind, so the only sounds were machinery and heartbeat. The first sweep drew nothing but the soft noise of thermal clutter, the radar's own breath returning to it as green shimmer. "Transmit," Ephraim said. Not a command, not a dare. Talitha's finger paused over the enable switch. She had rehearsed the warnings. Don't stand near the aperture. Don't wear a pacemaker inside the exclusion zone. Don't climb the dish because you will be cooked like a marshmallow you didn't consent to become. She had rehearsed the joy and the fear and the possibility and the risk. She flipped the switch. The klystrons sang. It was not a scream. It was a cathedral tone, deep and pure, settling into a pitch that Talitha felt in her teeth. The dish grew serious, as if attention were a weight. On the scope, the baseline rose. The first pulse went out, clean, slim, vanishing into the air. Talitha watched the return. And there was nothing, which was everything. Empty sky, clear water, the sea stacked in bands of faint backscatter like the memory of rain. She hadn't expected fireworks. She expected exactly this. Proof that the system was awake, that the world was out there, that the mathematics of time and distance still agreed to meet her halfway. "Look at that range ring," Ephraim murmured, "sharp as a razor." The dish kept turning. She adjusted gain. She watched the small islands appear as studious humps, the lighthouse as a bright nail hammered into the coast. She watched a trawler amble home with its wake spilling like thread. She called the trawler on VHF, voice a little shaky out of proportion to the act. "Northbound trawler 2 miles south of Gullhaven Point. This is Headland Radar. You have good returns on my screen. Do you copy?" A man laughed into the radio, a sound like a weathered plank. "Headland, I copy. Tell your screen my deck's a mess and my coffee's worse." "Thank you," Talitha said, feeling ridiculous and relieved. "You're giving me a beautiful blip." "Flattering a fisherman," he said. "That radar's gonna marry you if it has sense." She logged the contact as if it were a handshake from a world that had been ignoring her. By midnight, she had filled a page with notes. At 037, a flight at altitude scribbled across her scope as so many splinters of energy, far above her real talent, but visible, comforting. At 054, a squall line teased the edge of the display and then broke itself on the headland without consequence. At 148, the dish hiccuped once, remembered its dignity, and smoothed out. Ephraim dozed in a folding chair, chin on chest, cap over eyes, the thermos still warm between his boots. Talitha paced a slow circle of cables and light, fingers hovering over knobs she had hunted down with tenacity she didn't have a word for yet. The dome felt like a rib cage holding a new animal that had chosen to live. At 0213, she heard footsteps on gravel outside the hatch. Her muscles took the memory of fear from the old world and tried to use it in this one. She turned down the audio gain so the klystron song dropped from cathedral to chapel and stepped to the door. The figure on the threshold was soaked to the knees and breathing like he'd been running uphill through water. He held his hands out, palms up as if to show he had nothing. "Don't shoot." He blew a fuel line out past the point. "The engine died, the radio is dead, and the fog—" He swallowed. "The fog is a prison. I saw your light." Talitha glanced at the screen. If the boat was small and hugging the rocks, if he had no radar reflector, he'd be a moth in an eclipse. "How far out?" He shook his head helplessly. "Far enough to hear the bell buoy, not far enough to see my own hands." She moved aside. "Come in.
Tell me your boat's draft, your last heading, anything you remember. Ephraim!
The old man woke like a machine, a cough, a blink, and an instant purpose. 10 minutes later, the three of them were hunched over the scope, a compass, and a paper chart she'd taped to a plywood table, because the dome was old school, and so was Calamity. The young fisherman, he couldn't have been more than 20, found his breath and his voice, and not much else. The fog turned all his sentences into apologies. "We'll get you home," Talitha said, and she meant it so hard it hurt. She eased the gain, adjusted the tilt, watched the near-field clutter lift like a veil as the big dish breathed more deliberately near the water. The world resolved in shades of green. Rocks were teeth. The buoy was a heartbeat. The sea itself was noise that, properly persuaded, told the truth. She saw a smear of return that wasn't a rock and wasn't a gull, sliding slow along a contour a sane man wouldn't flirt with. "There," she said, and Ephraim leaned close. "You've got him? I have something that doesn't belong where it is." She picked up the radio and spoke in a voice she hoped sounded like a person who belonged behind a microphone. "Vessel hugging the lee of Gull's Jaw, this is Headland Radar. If you can hear me, you're halfway to being a story people tell wrong. Steer 10 degrees to starboard and keep that turn until I say stop." There was only fog. "Turn now," she said. "Trust me." Later, she would not remember whether seconds or years passed before a shape began to separate itself from the smear, swinging like a bead on a string into a safer lane between rock and regret. The fisherman's breath unlocked. Ephraim nodded once, which from him was a standing ovation. "Good," Talitha said into the silence. "Good. Hold that. You'll pass close to the bell. When you hear it, don't try to kiss it." A reply finally came, faint, frayed, and forgiven by the weather. "Headland Radar, if this works, I will paint your name on my transom and never take it off." "Hold your paint," she said, and laughed once because sometimes the body insists. "Yalomi pie." They walked the boat home with words and green light. When he was close enough to see the harbor's red and green winks, she set the radio down like a baby she didn't want to wake. The fisherman stared at the screen as if it were a constellation that had stooped to his level. "You built this?" he asked. "No," she said, "because some truths make the spine straighter. I learned to help it remember what it was for." "Then remember me. My name's Jesse Pardo. If you tell the diner you want pie, they'll know who to burn it for." When he left, his step steadier, Talitha sank into the chair beside Ephraim. "First save," he said, pretending it was nothing and failing. She nodded, and the nod turned into a shaking that had nothing to do with cold. She pressed the heels of her hands to her eyes and cried for the boat she had not been able to save months ago. For the boy who might now get to grow old enough to complain about the price of fuel. For the machine that had agreed to be her friend. At 0331, her radio hissed again. The voice on it was not from a boat. "Headland Radar, this is Coast Guard Sector Bellwether. New installation?" Talitha straightened. "Sector Bellwether, this is Headland Radar. Experimental restoration under civilian license. Negative hazard to navigation, positive reporting. We just assisted a vessel in fog." "Copy, Headland. We have you on our list as dormant. Got a routine weather advisory going out at 0400. If you can stay up, we'll include your nowcast." She could have powered down. She should have, by any calculus of sleep or sanity. "We'll stay up," she said, and the Klystron seemed to hum approval. By dawn, word had begun to leak down the hill the way light leaks into a room when someone forgets to close the curtains. The bait shop opened early. The diner put on a pot the size of a tire. Jesse Pardo's mother rang the bell above the harbor chapel door so hard she nearly unseated it. When Talitha finally stepped outside to breathe air that hadn't been filtered by a generator, the headland smelled less like tin than like rain promised and delivered. She walked to the cliff edge.
The sea below wore a new face. Blue-gray with white seams, like someone had ironed its temper.
"I thought it would feel louder," she said, not sure if she was talking to the water or to Ephraim, who had joined her and unfolded himself to the ground with the authority of a man who had earned the right to creak. "It will," he said. "When people ask for things, when they come with stories the radar can't fix." "I know," she said, and she meant it as a vow and a warning to herself. They slept for 3 hours, the kind of sleep that resets the color of the world. They woke to a knock and a camera. A woman in a windbreaker with a local news logo stood at the door with a man whose beard hid a jaw set for argument. "Talitha Noor?" the woman asked. She wiped her hands on a rag and willed herself to conjure hospitality out of the toolbox. "That's me." "I'm Mara Teague with Channel 7. This is Brent. We heard about the rescue and the restoration. Mind if we ask some questions?" She minded, very much. She wanted to hide her machine like it was a candle in a draft, but she also remembered fuel lines and fog and a boy on a screen like it was a miracle. "You can ask," she said, "and you can film the outside of the dome. And you cannot film the control panel or the transmitter cabinet. And if anyone touches anything red, I will cry and you will feel terrible." Mara smiled as if that were the arrangement she had hoped for all along. She asked the good questions. What's it like to wake a giant? What do you owe the town? What do you ask from it in return? Talitha answered as best she could, which was never as well as her machine deserved. When Mara asked whether she was afraid, she looked at the dish and told the truth. Yes. The first rule is to be afraid of the right things and brave about the others. By afternoon, a man with a suit that had not been designed for wind was standing where the grass gave up. He was from the state, with a title that sounded like a drawer full of paper. "We'll need to evaluate emissions compliance. We'll need a memorandum of understanding if any data is shared. We'll need—" She put a folder in his hands. "You will find in here the last 6 months of numbers, in triplicate, labeled in a font that won't give you a headache." He blinked. "You anticipated—" "Everything I could imagine, which still left everything else." At sunset, the sky went the color of raw copper, and the dome turned it into something you could wear. Talitha stood with her palm on the dish again, as if to introduce it to the night. "I will keep you honest," she said to the machine, "if you keep me kind." She did not say aloud that she always expected the headland to give something back, some personal revelation wrapped in physics. She did not expect the night to give her a stranger's life on a plate and tell her to guard it. She did not expect the morning to bring television. She did not expect any of what happened at 2219. The second night felt different from the first. The air had teeth. Far offshore, lightning stitched the horizon into a seam. Radar likes weather like that. It draws it like charcoal on linen, soft and precise and fatalistic. Talitha set the scope to a range that felt like a hand extended as far as it could without getting pretentious. She logged a cargo ship 30 miles south, tucking itself into a sensible lane. She logged 2 small craft 5 miles east, arguing with the word safe. She logged a formation of geese that confused the clutter algorithm for a minute and made her grin. At 2219, the dish began to hesitate. It was not a slip you would notice if you were a casual tourist of machines. It was a breath half caught. Talitha's skin prickled. She touched the console's edge to feel the vibration going through it. The rotation motor held steady at 6 RPM. The pedestal temperature was fine. The Klystron's hum tracked like a faithful dog. But the scope. Ephraim. He was already rising, coffee forgotten. "What do you have?" "Not nothing," she said. "Not something. Watch." At bearing 123 degrees, range 18 miles, a return surfaced and sank. It did not move like weather. It did not move like a boat or a bird or a malfunction. It moved like an argument with the rules. "Ghosts?" Ephraim asked. "Ghosts don't make the Doppler sing," she said,
and the hairs on her arms agreed with the word sing. The return had a velocity component that said it was not painted onto the screen by whim. She dialed the gain down, then up, then sharpened the pulse compression to a degree that made the backscatter twitch. The return bloomed. Then, as if offended by the attention, it shrank. "Range 18, bearing 123, she said into the radio, hailing the Coast Guard. "Sector Bellwether, this is Headland. Possible unidentified surface contact." "Define possible, Headland." "Transient but recurring. Doppler indicates real movement, not side lobes. No AIS correlated." She would have tagged it as a stupid fisherman, except stupid fishermen had transponders and habits. She would have tagged it as a rock, except rocks did not keep changing bearing in a slow, deliberate spiral like a dog sniffing a yard it intends to own. "Copy," Sector Bellwether said. "Any visual?" She stepped to the hatch and opened it. The night answered with wind. The horizon had vanished behind a curtain of ink you could taste. The Headland lighthouse threw its pattern like a metronome and hit nothing visible. "Negative visual," she said, returning to the screen. The return had jumped. Not far. Far enough to drive a splinter under instinct. "It's closer," she said. "How much closer?" Ephraim asked. 3 miles in 2 sweeps. "That's fast." "Unless it's a course change that puts it into the tooth of my beam," she countered, clinging to the comfort of hypotheses. She switched modes. The radio obeyed. The return sharpened again, as if it had decided to be cooperative and mean at once. The contact was now at range 14, bearing 125. It grew a tail of weaker echoes, like a comet. The scope painted a thin halo around it when she played with the threshold, a ring that shouldn't happen unless the thing produced energy of its own at frequencies she wasn't asking for. Her throat tightened. "Sector Bellwether, Headland again. New range 14. Behavior suggests—" She didn't know what it suggested. She knew what it defied. "Anomalous reflectivity." "Headland, say again?" "Anomalous. And accelerating." Wind shoved the dome and made it announce its age. Ephraim's hand found the back of her chair the way people reach for pews when the hymn climbs too fast. Talitha's mind raced through checklists, side lobes, multipath, ducting, angels. None of them fit like a glove. On the fishing pier, someone screamed. She didn't hear it with her ear. She saw it on the scope, because people scream with boats sometimes, and boats jump. A cluster of small returns near the harbor mouth jittered as if the sea itself had flinched. Range 12, bearing 126. The return had jumped again, like a chess piece with permission to be a knight and a queen. Her radio crackled with local anger. "Headland, this is Harbor Patrol. What the hell is that? I got water pulling like tide in a place that thinks it's a lake." "Stay inside the breakwater," Talitha said, and heard her voice become a shape it hadn't been yet. "No one go past the bell." Say it back. "Stay inside, copy." She imagined the town below tugging itself into a single muscle, doors opening, porch lights flooding, people remembering the Calico Jane whether they admitted it to themselves or not. She imagined the headland as a skull, the dome as an eye, her hand the lid that could not afford to close. "Tal?" Ephraim said softly. He only called her that when something tall and invisible was walking toward them. Range 10, bearing 126. The return thickened, hollowed, then thickened again. She saw interference patterns she had only ever seen in textbooks, where they were polite and lived in margins. "Sector Bellwether," she said, fighting the tremor in her mouth. "This is Headland. I don't have a label. If you have a cutter within 20 miles, advise holding. Strongly." "Headland, are you declaring an incident?" Was she? Did civilians declare anything that mattered? She looked at Ephraim. He nodded once, as if the word had a lever and he had decided she could pull it. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I am." The thing, she could not stop calling it that now because it demanded a pronoun, reached range 8 miles and then did something that made her forget how to be a person for a breath. It vanished. No decay, no smear, a blink. "Lose it?" Ephraim asked, but his voice said he already knew she hadn't. "Stand by," she whispered, and her hands went cold and the scope made a choice without her. Because it reappeared at range 3, bearing 126. Inside the harbor radius if the numbers were liars, on top of the headland if they were saints. It floated as steady as a buoy and as wrong as a snowfall in July, and every return near it, boats, buoys, rocks, bent around it like space had developed a soft spot. Talitha's mouth went dry. "Sector Bellwether," she said. It's here." "Define here, Headland." She stepped to the hatch because language needed air, because she had to look at something that was not a screen. She opened the door and felt the night press against her face like cloth. The lighthouse threw its pattern. The headland hummed with old electricity and new fear. Below, in town, someone had started to ring the chapel bell again, not in praise this time, but in warning. She lifted her eyes to the place where the bearing pointed. There was nothing to see, not with eyes. But above the cliff, just out past the drop, the air had a thickness to it, a shimmer that didn't belong to heat or rain. The wind was wrong there. It curled as if it had decided to kneel. The hair on her forearms stood up and stayed. Ephraim's hand closed on her elbow. "Back inside." "It shouldn't be able to do that," she said, as if the night would apologize. "Back inside," he repeated, his voice now the kind of gravity that keeps planets from wandering off. They shut the hatch. The dome felt suddenly like a ship, the storm something you ride instead of watch. The screen showed the return steady at 3 miles, steady in a way that made the rest of the world wobble. "Audio," Ephraim said. She hesitated, then flipped the switch. Most nights, the audio channel was the radar's pulse turned into a heartbeat too slow for anything but the body to admire. Tonight, it was odd, a coarse layered thrum like bees, like wires under strain, like the underside of a thunderhead if it could hum a note. "Turn it down," Ephraim said. But she didn't. She leaned closer and heard something else under the thrum. Voices. Not words exactly, not syllables she could hand to a dictionary. A pattern, a rise and fall that made her think of radio checks between people who had forgotten they could speak aloud. "Sector Bellwether," she said, and it felt like asking a lifeguard whether the ocean was allowed to be wet. "Are you hearing this?" "Negative, Headland. Our receivers show normal traffic only. Are you reporting interference?"
"It's not interference," she said, and for the first time since she stepped into the dome 2 months ago, her voice cracked on the truth of her own ignorance. It's talking." "Headland, advise." She couldn't advise. She could witness. The audio slid a note up her spine. The return began to shift, range 2.8, 2.7, 2.6. Each tenth of a mile like a footstep on a stair that didn't exist before the foot found it. Her head filled with the knowledge of how far 3 miles is when you're standing at the edge of a cliff wishing you'd never wanted to be useful. "What do we do?" she whispered, and hated the question even as it saved her from the arrogance that kills people. "We remember the boat," Ephraim said, "and we talk like you talked then." She picked up the microphone with hands that had solder burns and engine grease and a callus where the console edge had taught her bone to be patient. "Unidentified contact at range 2.6, bearing 126. This is Headland radar. If you can hear me, make a constant bearing decrease range unsafe for town and harbor. Adjust course 5 degrees to starboard. Acknowledge with any action." The audio answered with a shift that felt like curiosity. The return at 2.6 held steady. "Again," Ephraim said, as if he had a metronome hidden in his chest. "Adjust 5 degrees starboard. Acknowledge. Range 2.5. Not away. Toward." "Sector Bellwether," she said, everything in her going very still around the words. Advise immediate shelter for vessels in Gullhaven. This contact is closing on the headland with behavior inconsistent with known traffic or weather phenomena. Copy headland. Broadcasting now. Do you require assistance? She almost laughed because the dome was a voice with no body. And what assistance do you send to a question mark? If you have eyes on the cliff, keep them there, she said instead. She reached for the power switch for transmit. Talitha, Ephraim said softly, warning and faith in equal measure. If it's taking energy from us, maybe we pause. Maybe we... The lights flickered. Not a lot. Enough. The generator coughed and kept its promise. The scope steadied. The return sharpened as if it enjoyed a dim room. Talitha thumbed the transmit off. The dish kept turning, but the scope fell to the ghost of itself. In the sudden quiet, the audio hymn didn't stop. It grew. Not ours, she whispered. Whatever it is, it's not listening to us talking less. She flipped the transmit back on. The klystron found its note as if offended by her lapse. Range 2.3. She dialed a narrow sector scan and threw all of the radar's attention into a wedge the width of a narrow street. The dish obliged, focused, leaned in. The return fattened, and around its edges the halo thickened into petals. "Do you see that?" she asked, even though she knew he did. Interference pattern. Like something with a skin. She did not want that sentence in the world. She could either leave it there or use it. "Sector Bellwether," she said, everything in her going very still around the words. "Advise immediate shelter for vessels in Gullhaven. This contact is closing on the headland with behavior inconsistent with known traffic or weather phenomena. Copy headland. Broadcasting now. Do you require assistance?" She almost laughed because the dome was a voice with no body. And what assistance do you send to a question mark? "If you have eyes on the cliff, keep them there," she said instead. She reached for the power switch for transmit. "Talitha," Ephraim said softly, warning and faith in equal measure. "If it's taking energy from us, maybe we pause. Maybe we..." The lights flickered. Not a lot. Enough. The generator coughed and kept its promise. The scope steadied. The return sharpened as if it enjoyed a dim room. Talitha thumbed the transmit off. The dish kept turning, but the scope fell to the ghost of itself. In the sudden quiet, the audio hymn didn't stop. It grew. "Not ours," she whispered. "Whatever it is, it's not listening to us talking less." She flipped the transmit back on. The klystron found its note as if offended by her lapse. Range 2.3. She dialed a narrow sector scan and threw all of the radar's attention into a wedge the width of a narrow street. The dish obliged, focused, leaned in. The return fattened, and around its edges the halo thickened into petals. "Do you see that?" she asked, even though she knew he did. Interference pattern. Like something with a skin. She did not want that sentence in the world. She could either leave it there or use it. "Sector Bellwether," she said, everything in her going very still around the words. "Advise immediate shelter for vessels in Gullhaven. This contact is closing on the headland with behavior inconsistent with known traffic or weather phenomena. Copy headland. Broadcasting now. Do you require assistance?" She almost laughed because the dome was a voice with no body. And what assistance do you send to a question mark? "If you have eyes on the cliff, keep them there," she said instead. She reached for the power switch for transmit. "Talitha," Ephraim said softly, warning and faith in equal measure. "If it's taking energy from us, maybe we pause. Maybe we..." The lights flickered. Not a lot. Enough. The generator coughed and kept its promise. The scope steadied. The return sharpened as if it enjoyed a dim room. Talitha thumbed the transmit off. The dish kept turning, but the scope fell to the ghost of itself. In the sudden quiet, the audio hymn didn't stop. It grew. "Not ours," she whispered. "Whatever it is, it's not listening to us talking less." She flipped the transmit back on. The klystron found its note as if offended by her lapse. Range 2.3. She dialed a narrow sector scan and threw all of the radar's attention into a wedge the width of a narrow street. The dish obliged, focused, leaned in. The return fattened, and around its edges the halo thickened into petals. "Do you see that?" she asked, even though she knew he did. Interference pattern. Like something with a skin. She did not want that sentence in the world. She could either leave it there or use it. "Sector Bellwether," she said, everything in her going very still around the words. "Advise immediate shelter for vessels in Gullhaven. This contact is closing on the headland with behavior inconsistent with known traffic or weather phenomena. Copy, Headland. Broadcasting now. Do you require assistance?" She almost laughed, because the dome was a voice with no body. And what assistance do you send to a question mark? "If you have eyes on the cliff, keep them there," she said instead. She reached for the power switch for transmit. "Talitha," Ephraim said softly, warning and faith in equal measure. "If it's taking energy from us, maybe we pause. Maybe we—" The lights flickered. Not a lot. Enough. The generator coughed and kept its promise. The scope steadied. The return sharpened as if it enjoyed a dim room. Talitha thumbed the transmit off. The dish kept turning, but the scope fell to the ghost of itself. In the sudden quiet, the audio hymn didn't stop. It grew. "Not ours," she whispered. "Whatever it is, it's not listening to us talking less." She flipped the transmit back on. The Klystron found its note as if offended by her lapse. Range 2.3. She dialed a narrow sector scan and threw all of the radar's attention into a wedge the width of a narrow street. The dish obliged, focused, leaned in. The return fattened, and around its edges the halo thickened into petals. "Do you see that?" she asked, even though she knew he did. Interference pattern. Like something with a skin. She did not want that sentence in the world. She could either leave it there or use it. "Sector Bellwether," she said, everything in her going very still around the words. "Advise immediate shelter for vessels in Gullhaven. This contact is closing on the headland with behavior inconsistent with known traffic or weather phenomena. Copy, Headland. Broadcasting now. Do you require assistance?" She almost laughed, because the dome was a voice with no body. And what assistance do you send to a question mark? "If you have eyes on the cliff, keep them there," she said instead. She reached for the power switch for transmit. "Talitha," Ephraim said softly, warning and faith in equal measure. "If it's taking energy from us, maybe we pause. Maybe we—" The lights flickered. Not a lot. Enough. The generator coughed and kept its promise. The scope steadied. The return sharpened as if it enjoyed a dim room. Talitha thumbed the transmit off. The dish kept turning, but the scope fell to the ghost of itself. In the sudden quiet, the audio hymn didn't stop. It grew. "Not ours," she whispered. "Whatever it is, it's not listening to us talking less." She flipped the transmit back on. The Klystron found its note as if offended by her lapse. Range 2.3. She dialed a narrow sector scan and threw all of the radar's attention into a wedge the width of a narrow street. The dish obliged, focused, leaned in. The return fattened, and around its edges the halo thickened into petals. "Do you see that?" she asked, even though she knew he did. Interference pattern. Like something with a skin. She did not want that sentence in the world.
For a second, that folded like paper and kept folding, erasing color, erasing depth, erasing even the memory of green phosphor. Talitha's breath hitched. She did not know she had been leaning forward until the bloom made her flinch back, ribs knocking the console, knuckles finding metal. The audio channel plunged to a bass that made the bolts in the floor feel like drumheads. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. The white receded as suddenly as it had swallowed. The scope returned in pieces. Sweep line, range rings, the stuttering handwriting of weather. Then, like a pupil constricting, the anomalous return reappeared at 2 miles, bearing 126, a fist-sized brightness that pulsed as if matching something that was not a heartbeat and wanted to be. "Talitha," Ephraim said, the syllables clipped short to keep them from breaking. "Talk to me." "I'm here," she said, though her voice felt borrowed. "We still have rotation. We still have HV. We still—" She checked the klystron filament current the way a nurse checks a sleeping child for fever with the back of a hand. Normal. "We still have a transmitter." The handheld radio lay on the console like a coin that had been dug from another century. She did not touch it. She watched the scope. She let the breath that wanted to turn into a tremor find structure in counting. "Sector Bellwether," she said into the fixed mic, keeping her eyes on the scope. "Contact holding 2 miles. We experienced a full-screen saturation. Likely internal overload, not external lightning. We're stable." "Copy, you're stable," the Coast Guard said. "Too calm and therefore comforting. We read your barometric holding at 982 millibars. That drop is still localized at your grid. Harbor Patrol reports unusual current at the mouth. We've ordered all small craft to shelter." Ephraim reached up and turned the audio down 2 ribs, enough to free thought without losing the hum's shape. "You heard it too," he said, nodding at the handheld. "I did." I forced my eyes away from the scope for the smallest possible betrayal of vigilance. "Patrol Flight 37, 1958. If it was a recording, it was a recording that knew my name. It called you Headland Station, what this place was when I was a boy. And it asked for bearing to Beacon. We are not that beacon." "Tonight, we are what we are," he said, as if that were an answer, and perhaps it was the only one. She toggled the sector scan narrower, then narrower still, until the dish's attention pinched into a knife. The anomalous return fattened, and the ring around it tightened into petals, 6 faint lobes that came and went with the regularity of a machine and the rudeness of weather. "Not random," she murmured. "Nothing about this is," Ephraim replied. The handheld clicked again, not a call, but a cough of a world finding its throat. Talitha did not lift it. She could not split herself between now and then without bleeding into both. "Headland," Harbor Patrol cut in on the fixed set, breathless and angry, the way men sound when they've been asked to hold still in the face of something that wants to make them run. "Headland, we've got a standing wave in the channel like God put his hand down and pushed." "Copy," she said. Her mouth was dry. "Maintain position inside the breakwater. Keep lines ready to cut if you need to free boats. Do not, repeat, do not, put anyone past the bell." "Say it back," Ephraim said under his breath, and Harbor Patrol did, obedient and furious. She made herself name the thing without naming it. Contact, return, target. The words felt like asking a storm for ID. Her index finger hovered over the horn switch again, then withdrew. If nothing in the physics she knew could tell her what this was, at least etiquette could. Don't shout when whispering is working. Don't whisper when silence will do.
The hatch banged. A body filled the doorway and shed water onto the floor like a dog. Inspector Howell stepped inside without waiting to be invited, yanked the door closed, and stripped a hood back from hair that had lost its braid and decided to be a rope. "Exclusion zone is clear," she said as greeting. "The fence is holding. Half the town is at the chapel. The other half is pacing the pier, and I told them I would come up here and make sure you were not about to cook us all like a Thanksgiving experiment." Her gaze traveled to the scope, snagged on the anomalous return, and did not move. "What in God's ledger is that?" Talitha let herself smile in pure relief for having Howell in the room. "Something that listens," she said. "Something that wants something. Maybe just attention. Maybe energy. Maybe both." Howell stepped close, her eyes darting over the indicators like a medic's over wounds.
Your HV is inside the lines. Your waveguide temp is high, but not wrong. Your coolant loop is... She pressed a palm against the supply line and sucked a breath. Hot. How long have you been at full transmit? On and off, Talitha said. I'm modulating to avoid cooking the klystron. Cook it if you have to keep that out of town, Howell said simply, and for a second Talitha loved the straight line between the woman's duty and her mouth. The handheld radio crackled with soft persistence. Talitha pulled it to her lips with a hand she did not want to watch shaking. Patrol Flight 37, she said, feeling each word find a rung. This is Headland. Say position. Static. Then, we have no position worth a prayer. We have a horizon that keeps changing its mind. We have instruments that disagree with one another like uncles at a wedding. We have fuel like a rumor, and courage like a bad joke, and I would appreciate a bearing to a beacon we can trust. The voice was steady, because it had to be steady, and very young. Copy 37, Talitha said. Stand by. She looked at Ephraim and Howell. If I give him present bearings, I could be speaking a language his compass can't hear. He asked for what this station would have told him then, not now, Ephraim said. Howell's brows knit. How do you talk to 1958 with a tongue from 2000 and... She didn't finish. There are years you don't speak aloud in an emergency because they take too long to say. Talitha did not try to calculate the moment's metaphysics. She did the thing that had saved a boy in the fog. She made a decision and trusted it. She set the scope to a longer range than she liked. Something vintage, something the manuals from the generator room would have understood. She brought the lighthouse up like a nail again. She brought the dead analog beacon's coordinates out of her training license memory like a song. 37, she said. Set heading 126 true and hold it. Climb Angels 3 and hold it. If your beacon is sick, we will be your bell. When you think you've overflown us, you probably haven't. Do not descend. Say again, do not descend. A breath. Roger 37, heading 126, climbing 3. The voice grew smaller with distance that existed only in the part of the world where people keep their sanity. We'll ride your bell. The anomalous return pulsed, brighter, then brighter again, as if someone had told the sky a joke it wanted to laugh at with teeth. Ephraim pressed his lips together in a frown that was not for anyone present. If there's a mouth on that thing, I don't love we're ringing dinner. Talitha's instinct, stubborn, sharp, and probably the thing that made the town misname her bravery, crazy, flared. Then we feed it a taste it doesn't like. We modulate. We make our pulse a shape we can steer with.
Talk me through it, Howell said, already moving to the auxiliary panel, the same way she had moved toward a broken spillway last spring and asked for shovels without checking whether her shoes cared for mud. Talitha ran fingers over switches that were older than her mother and still remembered how to be useful. I can't change frequency without rebuilding the universe, but I can change pulse repetition frequency. If it's responding to a clean tone, we dirty it. If it ignores dirt, we sing louder. She dialed the PRF off the neat integer that made engineers happy into a staggered pattern that made math work harder. The audio hum changed, not a lot, enough for ears. The return flickered, offended or amused. Headland Harbor Patrol said, voice tense to snapping, "That push we told you about, it stopped pushing. Now the water's sucking like a giant mouth. If it keeps up, the channel'll empty like a basin." "Everyone off the floats," Howell said, stepping to the mic and borrowing authority the way some people borrow a cup of sugar. "Now! Tie off to the pier cleats, not the pilings. If you see a boat you can't keep, let it go. That is an order." Talitha pictured the floats going down on their lines like broken knees, the zincs scraping barnacles, the screaming of hardware, the quick little physics of rope under load. She kept her hands steady on the PRF and her eyes steady on the scope. The return held. Range 1.9. "Sector Bellwether. Headland. We are experiencing water displacement in the channel. We are attempting to hold the contact at current range." "Copy. We have a cutter en route 20 minutes out. We're patching in NOAA on the Barrow. They are
interested. Of course they were. Everyone loves a mystery until the mystery eats their lunch. The handheld coughed again with calm desperation. Headland 37, Angels 3, heading 126. We have a light, but it doesn't make sense. It feels like it's where the ocean should end. It feels like a door put where there should be a wall. Talitha's knuckles went pale. Do not descend, she said again. You're hearing a bell that is not for you. That bell is for boats. Ride the tone you're on. Roger, Headland. A pause. Then softly, what are you? She almost said, a girl who couldn't stand to watch a town lose another boy. She said, I'm your bearing to Beacon, and let him hear the smile that would convince him it wasn't a lie. Ephraim had taken the horn circuit panel apart with the gentlest of a man taking apart a clock. He reconnected it not to the single great voice on the cliff, but to the small voice inside the dome, the speaker that carried the radar's heartbeat. Give it a second bell, he said, eyes intent on wires. Talitha flipped the toggle and the dome filled with a tone no human throat could make. The audio hum took it, chewed it, changed it. The anomalous return grew a second halo, faint, offset. It jellied in place, as if considering which song to love. Talk to me, Howell demanded, not as a superior to a subordinate, but as a best friend to a brain that was starting to leave the room. Time, Talitha said, and heat. She yanked the cooling loop 2 notches hotter against every instinct she had spent 2 months training into habit. The klystron's note thickened, and for a second she imagined it disapproving, the way a father might disapprove when his child lifted a car to get a dog under the tire. The PRF pattern began to work, not because physics suddenly loved them, but because sometimes a complicated song makes something that was about to eat you stop and dance. The return wavered and stopped at 1.9. The halo turned into symmetrical lobes. The audio hum stabilized into a chord that was still wrong and less wrong at once. Harbor Patrol, Howell said, listening to her phone even while she kept her eyes on the scope. Reports the channel's slurping stopped. We have a dozen boats aground in the mud, but nobody in the water. She exhaled once in real gratitude. We can fix boats. Talitha nodded, feeling the kind of tire that organizes itself into a box so it can be opened later. She held the PRF with fingertips and the dish with intention. The handheld came back with a new voice, same call sign, same discipline, a different mouth. Headland, this is 372. Our leader says you're the bell. We confirmed VHF homing unreliable. Request verification of wind aloft. Talitha swallowed. She had NOAA on the second set with numbers that belonged to now. She had the manuals for then with numbers that liked to lie to present company. She reconciled them the way she had reconciled herself to buying a ruin, by deciding. Call it 20 knots out of 205, light chop topside, smooth through Angels 3. Copy. Tell your bell we're listening. Then hear this, she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of it. Do not turn toward anything that looks like a second sunrise. Hold your heading until your instruments stop arguing about what a horizon is. Ephraim's head jerked toward her. Howell shot her a look that was part admiration, part alarm. A second sunrise? She mouthed. Talitha didn't answer. She could feel it. Not with skin, with the part of a person that knows when a room holds its breath. The air beyond the hatch thickened. The lighthouse pattern felt like it was rolling down someone else's hill. The return at 1.9 vibrated once like a plucked string and then settled into obedience no one had earned. Headland, the Coast Guard said, a new voice, crisp, collected, and owning the room like a man who never had to raise his volume. This is Cutter Harrier, actual. 10 minutes to your position. We have a hello spinning up. We're reading your borrow and tide. We do not love what we're reading. Request you define your needs. Hold the breakwater, Howell answered before Talitha could, because that is what a county inspector is when one is worth having, a bridge between the ask and the answer. Keep stupid people from doing brave things. If you have eyes that can see what we can't, lend them. Copy, Harrier said, without a trace of jurisdictional fuss. Our eyes are yours. Talitha had not realized she had put her hand on the hatch until she felt the cold through the metal. She wanted to look out to verify that the night still had 3 dimensions and not 1. She didn't. She watched the scope. She watched the return. She listened to the audio hum the way she used to listen to her mother's sewing machine, not to the sound, but to its health. 37 lead, she said. Confirm fuel state? Silence. Then the young voice again, clipped shorter than before. Enough to be brave twice and stupid once. Then be brave twice, no more. Howell touched her shoulder. They're real? She whispered, not as a question, but as a surrender. Real enough to die, Talitha said, and if her voice shook, it was not from doubt. The room shifted. No, the dome stayed the dome, and the world decided to do something to gravity. The floor lifted a fraction and settled with a shiver as if the cliff had shrugged. The scope jumped an eighth of an inch and then remembered where the glass ended. The anomalous return's petals flared and then pinwheeled back into symmetry. Report, Harrier said, voice still even, which made it sound like courage.
Contact holding, Talitha said. Range 1.9 and change. She didn't say the change was a heartbeat and a half. Some math is not for sharing. Ephraim swore softly in a language made of oceans and workshop benches. Waveguide is sweating, he said. I'm seeing condensation where nothing should sweat. Either we're colder than we think or the air is lying about its life choices. Can you seal it? Howell asked. Conceal a wedding ring to a whisper if I have to, he said, and reached for the roll of sealing tape with hands that remembered, under every nick and scar, the first time they learned to save a thing that wanted to break. Do it, Talitha murmured, eyes not leaving the scope. We're keeping transmit on. If the klystron screams, it screams. The audio hum shifted again, and this time there was a shape in it that was not tone. It hit her the way a memory hits, sideways, all at once. It was not words. It was not numbers. It was the difference between someone singing to themselves and someone singing to be heard. Sector Bellwether, she said, not for permission, but because people should be witnesses. We're experiencing what may be a structured signal writing our return. We're recording. Copy, Headland. Noah is now very interested. Noah can send a fruit basket, Ephraim muttered. Talitha took her palm off the hatch and placed it flat on the console, as if to ground herself through screws and circuits. Unidentified contact, she said, because if her world had decided to become bigger than physics, she could at least be polite. If you can hear me, we don't understand your language, but we understand stop and stay. If you understand ours, show us acknowledgement. The return brightened 1 degree and then dimmed 1 degree, as if someone had blinked. The audio cord rose a half tone and fell. Her scalp prickled. She said, again, acknowledge. Blink. Half tone. Howell inhaled an O that never made it to her mouth. Talitha's eyes filled, and she did not have time for that. She wiped them with a sleeve that tasted like dust and oil. We have 2 problems, she said, very softly, mostly to herself. A thing that could break the harbor, and a flight that might never have existed where I can save it. We do not let one kill the other. She spoke into the handheld. 3-7, be advised, there is a strong anomalous radio source near this headland. If you see anything that looks like a perfect circle where circles do not belong, do not fly into it. 3-7's laugh came back young and older than it should be. That is the kind of advice we don't get from the manual. We will consider ourselves scolded. A beat. Headland, we read your bell like choir. We think we are overhead. Ephraim looked at the scope. We do not read them, he said. A statement of physics, not faith. We don't read them on this instrument, Talitha answered, a statement of her soul. She forced herself to do the simple thing. If you're overhead, you should see our light. If you don't, count to 5 and pretend you do. Copy. Pretending is within our training. Then turn for outbound. If you keep 126, it will break you over water you can trust. Do not descent. Say it back.
Outbound now, not descending. 3-7's voice softened. Headland? Yes. If we don't find you again, thank you for being a bell. Her mouth wouldn't make a word that was big enough, so she made the smallest one. Go. The anomalous return pulsed in answer, not brighter, not dimmer, different. The petals around it shifted phase. The audio cords split again, not dissonant, not consonant, just more. The barometer pulled another millibar off the room. Harrier actual, Howell said, her jaw set so hard you could have bounced a nickel off it. "We could use your eyes now." "Harrier inbound." Harrier replied, "Helo spinning 2 minutes. We will be overhead in 5." Talitha toggled the PRF a fraction faster. The return wobbled but held. Ephraim finished his seal and patted the waveguide like a shoulder. Howell stood with her hands on the back of Talitha's chair and her feet braced like a boxer. Somewhere below the cliff, the chapel bell faltered and then steadied. Somewhere in town, Jesse Pardo's mother was probably bargaining with God in a kitchen that smelled like onions and courage. Somewhere in another year, a young pilot flew into or away from a circle that didn't belong to him because a stranger had said the word "don't" with enough love in it to be a command. The hatch rattled. It did not open. In the space between rattles, a sound came through the door that no hinge makes. The thin, crystalline shiver of something cold and bright moving through warm, damp air. "Frost," Ephraim said, mystified. "In June." Talitha's skin crawled. "Sector Bellwether," she said, knowing how insane it would sound in deciding that sanity was not a present consideration. "We're experiencing localized microclimate. We have frost forming on the outside of the hatch." "Copy," Sector said, in the voice of a person writing a new checkbox into a form. "We're having one word yet. Harrier confirms visible shimmer off your cliff. No heat signature consistent with industrial discharge. We don't have a word yet. Add one, and make it a good one because I will have to say it into a camera at dawn." "Copy, County." The scope didn't care about frost. The scope cared about pulses. The anomalous return let a sliver of space open between itself and the steady radius it had claimed. Range 2.03, 2.01, 2.00. "No," Talitha said aloud, so quietly it was almost a prayer and almost a threat. "Do not come closer." Blink. Halftone. "Harrier I," the cutter reported. "We see a distortion above your cliff. It's like heat over a road, inverted, but there's cold rolling off it. We have no object, only effect." "Understood," Howell said, without asking who on the helo had used the word inverted. "Keep your distance." The handheld radio, as if resentful of being an antique, chose that moment to be perfect. "Headland," came 37's voice, calmer than it had any right to be. "We have stars again." Talitha's throat burned. "Copy," she whispered. "Stay with them." "Your bell," he added, "is fading." "It should," she said. "It means you are where bells don't need to ring." The audio cord dropped an octave into a place human bodies are not designed to hear. The anomalous return's petals spun like a slow pinwheel and then folded, the way a jellyfish folds when the water around it says go. Range 2.1, 2.3, 2.5. "Harbor Patrol," Howell said into the local net. "Report channel. Slurp's gone. We got boats sitting ugly in mud and others trying to pretend they didn't almost meet God. Nobody dead, nobody missing. I'll file for the miracle paperwork in the morning." Talitha let her forehead rest against the heel of her hand for exactly one breath. Then she lifted it because lifting was her job. She held the PRF steady and said into the handheld, 37, if you can still hear me, you are clear of our cliff. Proceed outbound. You have a world to return to." "Copy, Headland," he said, and the smile in his voice was the kind that makes a person older and younger at once. "Would shake your hand if years were doors." The scope gave us what it could, a retreat. 2.8, 3. The petals diffused into haze. The audio cord softened into a note that was almost ordinary. "Transmit down," Ephraim said gently.
Talitha's finger hovered over the switch, then pressed. The klystron sighed into silence like a singer leaving the stage. The dish kept turning, obedient to momentum and the duty of circles. The dome went quiet enough to hear the generator's honest work and the thud of her own blood. They stood very still, 3 people in a shell of fiberglass and history, while the world remembered how to be 3-dimensional. "Report," Harrier said, voice less even and somehow more human. "We show your anomaly decreasing in visible effect.
We have no target. We have frost lines that are going to make for a very confusing training slide. Copy, Howell said. We are down transmit. We will hold rotation and watch. Good work, Kedland, Harrier added, the praise begrudged only by a professional's reluctance to hand out praise like candy. We'll put a boat in the cove in case your Cliff decides to do more tricks. Thank you, Talitha said, and meant it as if it had been a sentence she had waited all her life to speak to a stranger with a ship. The handheld radio lay quiet for the first time since a dead voice had borrowed it. Talitha touched it with the back of a finger as if it were sleeping. She did not want to put it away. She did not want to see it be a piece of plastic again. Sit, Ephraim said, and pushed a chair toward the backs of her knees. She did not sit. She took 2 steps to the hatch and laid a palm against it. Cold burnt the skin through metal for a second and then softened. She cracked the door. The night breathed on her. The smell of ozone and something clean, too clean, came and went. Frost traced ferns across the handle, delicate and confident. Beyond the door, the cliff was what it had been before, rock, grass flattened by wind, the rumpled hearsay of waves below. You're okay to stand, Howell said, not in question, but in acknowledgement. You're okay? No, Talitha said, feeling the truth like good medicine. And yes. She turned back to the scope and watched, because that was what she understood how to do. They didn't leave the dome. The dome left them. No, the night left, embarrassed at what it had done. Dawn feathered the horizon with gray that remembered how to be blue. The lighthouse pattern looked less like a metronome and more like a promise. Fog gathered itself like a shawl and went home. Mara Teague's van appeared at the fence as if it had never moved since yesterday and had simply slept like a large, faithful dog. She waved a hand too big for the distance and did not try the door. By 0600, the cutter lay off the headland like a punctuation mark. The helo hung a respectful distance downwind and kneaded the air into discipline. Harbor Patrol had a boat nosed into the mud as if it could convince physics to give the channel back out of sympathy. At 0630, the state official in the bad suit reappeared with a notepad and a face that had been told to be kind. He stayed behind the fence, pan moving like a man who suddenly understood how much ink weighs. At 0700, the church bell rang 3 times, the pattern for "We're still here." If anyone had died, it would have been different. At 0715, Jesse Pardo arrived with 2 paper cups of coffee, hot enough the lids sweated. He stood at the fence and lifted them high like offerings to a mountain god. Howell went to fetch them and bring the boy inside the exclusion line because kindness sometimes needs permission. "I brought pie, too," he said, cheeks red with cold and the kind of pride that has nothing to do with ego. "It's ugly because my mother bakes like she fights, and she fought the oven, and the oven lost." Talitha took the coffee and smelled it like a doctrine. "We held it," she said, the we doing the work of a pronoun that could carry a town. Jesse nodded like a man who had been on a pier in the dark and would rather not talk about it. He placed the pie on a level place and straightened a fork, like that straightening could impose order on the memory. "Folks don't think you're crazy this morning. They think you're an alarm with manners." "I'll take it," she said, and then, because honesty had been the night's only currency, "Never call me crazy in the past tense. I will always try things that don't want to be tried."
He grinned. "Good." He knuckled his hat. "Ma says you come to the diner when you can stand food again." He started to go, then turned back. "Talitha?" "Yes?" "Did you hear a plane?" he asked. "Not fishing for stories, just fishing for sense." "I heard men," she said, And I told them how not to die. He took that in like heat. Okay, he said, as if she had told him the tide. Inspector Howell started making lists out loud because that is how some fears put their shoes on and become tasks. Perimeter check. Data download. Statement to Coast Guard. Statement to NOOA. Statement to Channel 7 with reduced hysteria. Public advisory. Pier repairs. Tide survey. She paused. Sleep. We've got inspection, Ephraim said, because he trusted lists more than sermons. Klystron temper check. Bearings. HV contactor. Apology to machine, Talitha said, because love belongs on lists. We made it do too much. We will bring it tea. Howell snorted. Bring it grease. Grease and tea, Talitha said, and for the first time since the word white, she laughed, and the laugh didn't hurt anything. They ran the checklist of the living. They powered down the generator and listened to the dome stop humming like a cathedral and start breathing like a barn. They took off hard hats and put them back on because habits don't turn off at 0800. They let Mara Teague inside and filmed the dish from angles that did not include secrets, and when she asked the good questions, they gave her good answers and said, "We don't know," where they didn't. When Mara asked about the rumor of frost, Howell said, "We will discuss that after NOOA finishes naming it." And Mara said, "Fair, because reporters play long games with truth when it matters." By noon, the headland had become ordinary with a bruise, which is to say, it had become extraordinary to people who had never seen it alive. The cutter moved off. The helo went to teach air how to be useful somewhere else. Harbor Patrol went to borrow shovels. The state official sat on his car hood and let a gull consider his pen. The town learned to tell the story already, and like all towns, it told it in two versions that hugged each other and argued, one with angels, one with engineering. Talitha and Ephraim and Howell sat on the floor of the control room with their backs to the console and their legs out in front of them, like children after a thunderstorm. For a while they said nothing. Then Howell said, "The county will ask for protocols." "I'll write them," Talitha said. "They will ask who is in charge," Howell added. "I'll say, not me alone. Machines are a chorus. They sing best when more than one ear conducts." Ephraim nudged her boot with his. "You conducted. You made a bell out of a thing that was only a horn." She thought of 3-7's voice and the way it had climbed out of time to borrow her night. "We'll need a phone tree, a list of boats that can be moved fast, a line in the sand about the fence, a way to tell stories that doesn't lie when we don't know enough yet." Howell reached into a pocket and produced a spiral notebook that looked like it had been carried through 3 governments and a flood. "Start talking," she said. "I'll write." They built the bones of a plan while the dome cooled and the town reheated itself. They powered down the generator and listened to the dome stop humming like a cathedral and start breathing like a barn. They took off hard hats and put them back on because habits don't turn off at 0800. They let Mara Teague inside and filmed the dish from angles that did not include secrets. And when she asked the good questions, they gave her good answers and said, "We don't know," where they didn't. When Mara asked about the rumor of frost, Howell said, "We will discuss that after NOOA finishes naming it." And Mara said, "Fair, because reporters play long games with truth when it matters." By noon, the headland had become ordinary with a bruise, which is to say, it had become extraordinary to people who had never seen it alive. The cutter moved off. The helo went to teach air how to be useful somewhere else. Harbor Patrol went to borrow shovels. The state officials sat on his car hood and let a gull consider his pen. The town learned to tell the story already, and like all towns, it told it in two versions that hugged each other and argued, one with angels, one with engineering. Talitha and Ephraim and Howell sat on the floor of the control room with their backs to the console and their legs out in front of them, like children after a thunderstorm. For a while they said nothing. Then Howell said, "The county will ask for protocols." "I will write them," Talitha said. "They will ask who is in charge," Howell added. "I'll say, not me alone. Machines are a chorus. They sing best when more than one ear conducts." Ephraim nudged her boot with his. "You conducted. You made a bell out of a thing that was only a horn." She thought of 3-7's voice and the way it had climbed out of time to borrow her night. "We'll need a phone tree, a list of boats that can be moved fast, a line in the sand about the fence, a way to tell stories that doesn't lie when we don't know enough yet." Howell reached into a pocket and produced a spiral notebook that looked like it had been carried through 3 governments and a flood. "Start talking," she said. "I'll write."
Her shoulder, "and keep a copy, like a dragon." "Done," Talitha said. She stood and went to the rack that held the recorder. She pulled the drive and slotted it into a case with foam that loved it. She labeled it in block letters with a date she would never forget and a time window that tasted like metal. She printed the scope captures and laid them on the table. The petals around the anomalous retur looked like a flower that had learned calculus. Ephraim pulled a stool to the waveguide and put his face close to the seam. "No frost inside," he announced, as if he had discovered a small mercy. "We got lucky." "Or we were listened to," Howell said. Talitha didn't trust luck, and she didn't trust mercy that hadn't cost anything. "We were stubborn, that's what we were." By late afternoon, the dome had gone from sacred to maintainable. Ephraim had found 3 places to grease that hadn't known grease for 20 years. Howell had drafted a 1-page advisory that said in civilian, without saying in panic, "If the bell rings at night, stay off the pier and away from the cliff, and do not, under any circumstances, try to be a hero who outruns physics." Meritigue had filed a piece that made Talitha look braver than she felt, and the town looked kinder than it remembered being last winter. The state official approached with his pen and a hand that had learned to shake politely. "Miss Knorr," he said, "we'll need a formal briefing for the commissioner." "You'll have it by morning," she said. "If I sleep before then." "You will sleep," Howell said in a voice that had sent men off dangerous scaffolding, with their hearts beating for years afterward. "You will fall over, or I will carry you." The state official looked at the 3 of them and decided his job was to evacuate himself from their competence. "Thank you," he said, and found an errand downstream. At sunset, the headland wore copper again, and the dome threw it back in a color the sea understood. Talitha stood with her palm on the dish and said, "I am sorry I made you stay awake so long." She felt ridiculous and right. Machines did not take apologies personally, but people became better people when they gave them. "You're going to keep it on tonight," Ephraim said, not asking. "I am. Low power, watch only. No horn unless the sea needs a sermon." Howell nodded, satisfied enough to allow the compromise. "I'll post 2 at the fence. No tourist is going to Instagram into our accident report." They ate Jesse's ugly pie with forks that refused to behave. They drank coffee that had gone lukewarm and blessed it like soup. They told each other the parts of the night that had been personally terrifying in case speaking them made the town better at being a town. When the stars came, Talitha went back inside and turned on the dish with the gentleness of someone waking a friend from a nap. The scope lit. The sweep made its slow, sure circle. The sea breathed like a chest. The headland hummed a lullaby for itself. She promised herself she would sit for 10 minutes and then lie for 6 hours. She sat for 60. She did not lie. At 23:14, the PRF tickled the edge of a pattern her body recognized before her brain did. She leaned forward,
throat closing around hope and dread. The scope did not bloom white. It drew a small, polite brightening at the edge of the range, a postcard from a city that had decided to be better. "Ephraim?" she said softly. He was there before she had finished saying his name, as if he had learned to read it in the hum. "What do you have?" "Not what. Who?" She pointed at the edge of the scope. "Do you see it?" A faint would turn. Not anomalous, not impossible. Not a boat, not a rock. Something in the sky, at an altitude the dish, annoyed by its own design, was not meant to love, and loved it anyway, by accident. A thin smear. A line that caught and held for a sweep and then another. It was like catching a memory in the corner of a mirror. "Harrier, actual. This is Headland. Be advised we are reading a weak aerial target far out and high, bearing 126, inbound at speed consistent with a twin prop from another century." Harrier took his time answering. He was probably looking, and he probably learned in a long professional life that sometimes looking is disrespectful if you cannot see a thing because it isn't for you. "Copy, Headland. We have no visual, we have no radar paint. If you have angels, they're yours." The handheld radio, as if it had been waiting for permission to be a miracle again, crackled once, twice, then opened like a door in a story. "Headland, bearing to beacon no longer required," said a voice that was very tired and very full, as if a man had flown through an argument and won by refusing to raise his voice. "Copy, 3-7, she whispered, because names matter, and because he had never given her his, and she had decided the number was a name. "Welcome to morning."
Harrier took his time answering. He was probably looking, and he had probably learned in a long professional life that sometimes looking is disrespectful if you cannot see a thing because it isn't for you. "Copy, Headland," he said finally. "We have no visual. We have no radar paint. If you have angels, they're yours." The handheld radio, as if it had been waiting for permission to be a miracle again, crackled once, twice, then opened like a door in a story. "Headland," said a voice that was very tired and very full, as if a man had flown through an argument and won by refusing to raise his voice. "Bearing to beacon no longer required." Talitha's hand tightened on the plastic until the casing squeaked. "Copy, 3-7, she whispered, because names matter and because he had never given her his, and she had decided the number was a name. "Welcome to morning." "We thought," he said, and the way he said "thought" carried a lifetime in it. "If years had room, we might owe you something. We do not know how to pay, but if bells ever ring across oceans for you, we will stand." She did not understand the sentence in any way physics would like, and she understood it where understanding lives when numbers go to bed. "We'll be here," she said, "watching." The smear at the edge of the scope thinned and then was gone. The audio hum went back to its domestic chores. The dome remembered it was a dome. Ephraim made a sound halfway between a curse and a prayer. "If you tell that to anyone with a grant," he said, "they will come here with more paper than wind." "I will tell it to the Headland," she said, "and to you, and to anyone who brings boats into fog and thinks bells are old-fashioned." She wrote it down in the log. She wrote it down with the time and the barometric pressure and the PRF and the range and the phase and the sentence about bells. She labeled the page the way she had labeled the drive, with a date, a window, and a promise. In the small hours, when even gulls sleep and the ocean tells itself simpler stories,
Talitha stood at the hatch and let the night put its cool hand on her face. The cliff smelled less like tin and more like grass. The town below breathed with the even patience of people who had survived the thing they would have written papers about if they had been the kind of people who wrote papers. "You woke it?" Howell said behind her, quiet as fog. "I woke us," Talitha said. "Or we woke each other." "You're not wrong. And because I am the county and my job is to ruin beauty with forms, I will ask, what is it you think you are now?" Talitha watched the dish turn, smooth as a thought in a calm mind. "A bell," she said. "A bell that rings in more than one direction." She thought of her mother's calls, of coffee in the generator room, of Jesse's laugh, of Ephraim's hands, of a voice from 1958 that had taught her more about faith than any sermon. "And a promiser," she added, "to watch, to listen, to count the things that move, because knowing they moved might keep someone alive who would otherwise become a story." Howell nodded once. "Good. The county will print that on a sign." They did. A week later, there was a plaque at the fence with a paragraph that was part poetry and part legal, and it contained the word bell and the words "do not enter," and people read it, and some of them obeyed it, and some of them laughed and took photos anyway, and all of them told each other how the headland had shaken the bay and the past and everything that thought it was immune to alarm. Noah came and took the drive in a case like a crown. They took copies because Howell insisted. They brought coffee because Ephraim glared. They asked questions and received answers and stared out at the cliff and went away with eyebrows full of weather. Harrier sent a note on letterhead that said, "We are in your debt." Harbor Patrol sent a crate of hand-stamped signs that read, "If the bell rings, get off the pier." And there were typos because haste is an artist. Mara Teague aired a segment that made Talitha blush and Ephraim swear, and Howell hold her face in her hands and laugh because the world is always bigger and smaller than good stories make it.
"Not what," she said. "Who?" She pointed at the edge of the scope. "Do you see it?" A faint return, not anomalous, not impossible. Not a boat, not a rock. Something in the sky. At an altitude the dish, annoyed by its own design, was not meant to love, and loved anyway by accident. A thin smear, a line that caught and held for a sweep, and then another. It was like catching a memory in the corner of a mirror. "Harrier Actual," she said, kneed fighting manners into a draw. "This is Headland. Be advised we are reading a weak aerial target, far out and high, bearing 126, inbound at speed consistent with a twin prop from another century." At night, Talitha still slept in the trailer in the lee of the dome because she had not yet learned to sleep far from a machine that had learned her name. On a shelf above her bed, the handheld radio sat like a quiet animal. Some nights it muttered the polite nonsense of static. Some nights it lay still enough to be a stone. On one night, shortly before dawn, it clicked and said nothing, and clicked again and said nothing, and clicked a third time and said, in a voice older than the one who had first called her and younger than hers by a war, "Bell." She sat up and didn't answer because sometimes answering is too much to ask of a world that has done its duty for the day. She held the radio like a hand and listened to her own breath and to the dish outside turning, turning, turning. When storms came, she rang the horn and the town stayed off the pier, and boats were lost anyway, because this is a coastline and not a painting. When a boy went missing, she swept the dish, and the dish found him, and the town got to bury someone else instead when the time came, because this is a town and not a miracle.
When a summer tourist cut the fence, Howell had him building docks the next day until he learned the weight of what he had tried to ignore. The headland did not stop being a place where gulls stole sandwiches. It did not become a portal, a shrine, a laboratory, or a saint. It stayed a hill with a machine on it and people inside it who refused to stop learning. On an autumn night that smelled like rain on hot dirt, Talitha sat with Ephraim and Howell and Jesse in the control room while the dish made its circles. They were not waiting for anything, which is when the best things decide they're ready. The audio hum slipped down a note. The scope painted a thin ring at a range only math could love. No petals, no frost, no slurp, just the faintest blink. And then another, like applause from a room you could not enter. "Do you see that?" Jesse whispered, as if he were in a church and the machine were the choir. "Yes," Talitha said. "I see it." "What is it?" he asked. "A lesson," she said, smiling into the green. "That some nights the bell rings to tell you there is nothing to fear." They watched it together until it faded into the ordinary, and then they went outside and listened to the sea pretend it was new. Talitha put her hand on the dish the way you touch a friend's shoulder when you're leaving a good party. She said, "Thank you," to the machine, for remembering. She could feel in that cool composite skin the torque and the patience and the promise. Down in town, lights came on and off and on again. The church bell told the hour. The diner griddle hissed. The bait shop opened and men leaned on sacks of ice and argued about whose boat would live longest. Life, in short, decided to keep happening in defiance of physics and because of it. She went back inside and wrote one more line in the log under the morning's page. The bell rings both ways. It was not technical language, but it held a number she intended to obey. When she finally lay down in the trailer, exhaustion moved over her like a blanket heavy enough to be a promise. She closed her eyes and saw the screen blue-white again, not as terror, but as a door. She saw the petals around the return not as threat, but as a language. She saw 3 boys in a plane, not as ghosts, but as people who had chosen to believe a voice and who had been believed. She woke just before dawn because the body remembers everything it owes. She rose, brushed teeth with water that tasted like pennies and mountain, pulled on a sweater that had learned the shape of her stubbornness, and walked up the headland path. The dome stood in mourning like a lighthouse in reverse. She touched the hatch. It was not cold. She went inside. The dish turned. The scope drew its circle. The world showed up to be read. Talitha Newer took her seat, leaned in, and began her watch.